Robin Martin C. once said a quote that changed my life. It's not enough for your code to work. Well, yes, code is simply just a bunch of commands that you toss together in order to make a machine do something. However, that's not enough. In order to write code that innovates and inspires, your code must always be clean. Hi, I'm Yasajace here, and today we're going to be exploring 5 ways to write clean and efficient code. Why should we write clean code? When you write clean code, it's a lot more scalable, it has less errors altogether, it's easier to understand, it's easier to catch errors. Also, Google will more likely hire you. Anyway, I have a rule of thumb that allows me to remember the ways to write clean code. Today, I'll be exploring those 5 methods with you guys. So let's start. So we're going to be starting off this video with a very simple example, and that's called variable naming. So over here we have 2 variables, x and y, and all we're doing is just adding them out and printing out the value. Now you might be thinking there's nothing wrong with this. However, if we were to write variables like this all the time, it would make code very confusing because we don't know what's the value of x or what x's purpose is. Same with y. So always remember when you write your code, it needs to have proper variable naming. A much better example would be like this. Over here I have 2 numbers, number 1 and number 2. And all I'm doing is I'm adding out these numbers. We understand what every single variable is, and since we're adding it out, we're able to read the value of these numbers. This makes our code a lot more cleaner and understandable. The next thing we're going to be exploring is how to properly declare variables. So we now know how to properly name variables, but over here what we're doing is we're declaring the number 1, and then we're putting in the value of 5, number 2, putting in the value of 10. Then we're adding 2 to number 1 and adding 2 to number 2. Now while this seems fine and dandy, it becomes a bit harder to read when you're declaring all of your variables at the top and then doing your operations here. Instead, what you should do is declare one variable, do what you need to do with it, then declare the next variable, like this. So what I did was I declared number 1, I then added 2. Then I declared number 2, and then I added number 2. This makes our code a lot more neater, cleaner, and easier to read. Alright, the next thing we're going to be exploring is called functional programming. Over here I have 2 numbers and I'm having a third number called sum. What I'm doing is I'm adding number 1, I'm subtracting number 2, dividing number 1 with number 2, and multiplying the 2 of them together. Now, what I'm doing over here is a bit repetitive, and as you can see there's a lot of lines of code. Let's suppose if I'm continuously writing code and I realize I need to add it again. And this becomes repetitive. Instead of that, we should have functions that have our code stored, and we can reuse it over and over again. It should look a lot like this. If I were to take this and like that. So I'm currently calling upon these functions that I've written right above here. So I have add, which takes number 1 and number 2 and adds them, and same with all the other functions. These functions are being called, and let's suppose if my manager tells me that I want to take add and replace it with subtract. Well, now I only need to remove one word instead of having to change the equation. Now, of course, in real life you won't have problems like this with addition and subtraction, but things will be very similar, and if you ever find yourself repeating code over and over again, wrap it into a function and just keep on calling that function. It will save you time and stress. The next thing we're going to be exploring is called code comments. So code comments are used to write code or to write text that the compiler itself won't read. Every language has a different way of writing comments, but the way it usually works is with 2 slashes. And then you would just type in something. Now the purpose of code comments is to make your code cleaner to write. Oftentimes, however, people write tons of comments and it often makes the code unwanting to be read. Instead, the way you should write comments are only inside of functions, like so. Let's suppose if I want to talk about the function add. So instead of me writing a whole paragraph, all I should write is takes 2 ints and returns sum. Now, of course, this isn't how it's going to work in real life. In real life, you might want to say something like takes these numbers, inserts them into a database, etc., etc. But the idea is that they're short and concise. Now, another thing you guys should also be aware of is that in your comments you should also write things that shouldn't happen, or some sort of note that you might want someone to know about because it's confusing to realize on its own. For example, let's suppose if I'm talking about a function that inserts data into a database. However, the database itself does not allow, let's suppose, floats. So you might want to write a comment that says does not accept floats, like so. Does not accept floats. Alright? Okay, the final thing we'll be learning today is about Boolean logic. I have a whole video on this itself, but I'm just going to give you guys the gist of it. So, oftentimes beginners make the mistake of writing code like this. If Boolean is equal to true, execute. And sometimes they make even bigger like if statements. You guys shouldn't do that. Instead, just simply write it in such a way that it returns a Boolean no matter what. For example, over here it says if Boolean is equal to true. If statements by default check to see if it's true or false, and if true, then it will execute. There's no need to check to see if it's true because it's already specified if the value of the Boolean. Instead, write it like this. So if Boolean, and then it will check the value of Boolean, and as it's true, it's going to print out true. If I were to write false, let's suppose, it would check the value of Boolean, which is false, and instead print out it's false. Alright, so here's a recap of what happened in this video. So we uncovered 5 topics that we should go through each time when we're writing code. These 5 topics help make your code a lot cleaner and neater. The ones that we talked about are the naming of variables, so make sure that the names that you give are concise and easily understood. Variable declaration. Don't declare variables when they're not being used. Declare them right before they're about to be used. Functional programming. If you have repetitive code, instead of writing the code repetitively, put it into a function and reuse the functions. Comments. Use comments wisely. Don't write too much and don't write too little. Write enough so that the person can understand, and if there are any sorts of warnings that a person should know about, include them as well. Boolean logic. There's no need to constantly check if a value is true. Instead, just write the value itself, and the rest of it will be taken care of by the compiler. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a nice day.